today we're continuing in our Lent series on the Bible, gender, and sexuality with a real hot topic, which is the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Dun, dun, dun. We're going to read from Genesis chapter 19, but I thought I would give you a little bit of setup first. So Genesis chapter 18, you actually might be familiar with. It's a story where three strangers show up at Abraham's house, and he's like, oh, you guys, hey, stop, stay a while. Let me get you something to eat. And then it's like, quick, Sarah, could you just make some bread? This is the joke that Dave likes. Could you just make some bread real quick? Just whip it up. Yeah, but they prepare food for these strangers and welcome them to their home. It turns out these strangers are actually God and two angels, and they're like, hey, Abraham and Sarah, you guys are going to have a kid. And Sarah overhears this from the kitchen and she laughs. Remember that story? Because she's like, you guys, I am old, okay? But they're like, yeah, it's happening. So that story happens, and then these three strangers, God and the two angels, are going to go off. They're going to check out. They've heard some bad news about Sodom and Gomorrah being just terrible places, and they're like, we're going to go check it out and possibly destroy them. And God has this internal conversation where God's like, should I tell Abraham what I'm planning to do? I mean, I don't have to tell him, right? I'm God, but also he's important. Maybe I want to just talk this out with him. So God's like, Abraham, there's these terrible cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, I'm going to destroy them. And Abraham's like, cool. I mean, you're God, I'm just some guy. But what if there's 50 righteous people in the cities? Will you still, I mean, I don't know, I'm just saying, would you still destroy them? And God's like, well, I guess if there's 50, yeah, I won't destroy it. And Abraham's like, okay, yeah, that's great. Hear me out. What if but if there were just 5 fewer, you would still destroy it? And God's like, okay, no, for 45, I won't destroy it. And Abraham's like, oh, good, that's so good. What about I mean, I don't, again, who am I to even just, and this is what Abraham is saying, I'm just dust, I don't, but if there are 30, will you still, and God's like, oh yeah, okay, 30, that's fine, I won't destroy it. And they do this back and forth until they get to 10 people. If there are 10 righteous people, God's like, okay, I won't destroy it. Spoiler alert, there are not 10 righteous people. So the two strangers, the angels, have gone on. They're going to check out what's happening in these towns. So now we're all caught up. We're going to start at Genesis chapter 19, verse 1. And this is going to be a story involving this character, Lot, who is Abraham's nephew, Abraham's brother's son. And they have a whole history. But what happened was that they both had these flocks and these herds that were growing, and the shepherds and the herders were like, we don't have enough space for everyone's livestock to be grazing together, and if you guys try to stay together, we're gonna have a fight about it. And so Abraham and Lot are like, oh, okay, let's not have a fight. So they're like, okay, you go that way, I'll go this way. Cool. And they part ways. And so Lot has gone to the cities of the plain, Sodom and Gomorrah, and another city named Zoar, which he's going to end up living in. But that's your background. I think that's all the background you need. Okay, let's read it. Genesis 19, verse 1. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. And when Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way. They said, no, we will spend the night in the square. But he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them. Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge? Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. Then the men said to Lot, the strangers, the angels, "Have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of this place. For we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be joking. When the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or else you will be consumed in the punishment of this city." But Lot lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and left him outside the city. When they had brought him outside, they said, "Flee for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the hills, or else you will be consumed." And Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords, if your servant has found favor with you, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life, I cannot flee to the hills, for fear the disaster will overtake me and I die. Look, that city is near enough to flee to, and it's a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." The angel said to Lot, "Very well. I grant you this favor too, and will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Hurry, escape there, for I can do nothing until you arrive there." Therefore the city was called Zoar, which means little. The sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain, and saw the smoke of the land going up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the plain, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had settled. The word of the Lord.
There you go.
I was just reading, like, this fall, they found this new evidence. Have you heard this? That there was a small meteor that probably hit this part of the world, and that's like where this fire and brimstone maybe comes from in the collective imagination. Anyways, in our popular culture, Sodom and Gomorrah has become like this shorthand for any time we want to blame, especially gay people, right, for some terrible thing that's happened. The idea is that these cities were so wicked that there was no hope but for God to just destroy them. And it's a metaphor we conveniently steal when we want to hold on to judgment or blame. And of course, these cities, their wicked actions are often linked to homosexuality. It really does not help that we took the English word sodomy, used to refer to really any non-procreative sexual activity, but historically a word that's been deployed against the LGBT community, especially gay men. Doesn't help that we got that word from the name of one of these cities, right? Not I can remember personally the TV personality and ostensible Christian Pat Robertson likening the terror of destruction on September 11th, 2001 to the fire that rained down on Sodom. In fair payment, he said, for America's many sins. Do you remember that? More recently, he's clarified his thoughts, this is great, on the link between growing LGBTQ acceptance and America's challenges, saying, there isn't one single civilization that has survived that had openly embraced homosexuality. So you say, what's going to happen to America? Well, if history is any guide, the same thing is going to happen to us. Cool, Pat, thanks, Pat. Maybe you remember just the really loving way that churches responded to the 2016 mass shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. This was an LGBTQ welcoming space, a nightclub where people who were unable to express the fullness of their sexual and gender identities in their families or communities were able to experience a few moments of acceptance, the joy of being on the dance floor, the comfort and freedom of belonging. 49 people were killed that night, and for those who survived, the pain was compounded as they watched what happened to their departed friends. Many were not allowed to have funeral services at their home churches or be buried in church plots because the manner of their death revealed their sexual orientation. Instead of compassion or care, victims and survivors faced increased hate. One survivor said, quote, "My faith was really, really tested in the aftermath. Because as we know, there were a lot of pastors that said that this was something that deserved to happen to us, that this was something that was compared to Sodom and Gomorrah." And in just the past 2 weeks, a Russian Orthodox church leader, Patriarch Kirill, the Patriarch of Moscow, this is a very important Russian Orthodox clergy person in Russia, in a sermon that he gave on Forgiveness Sunday, I kid you not, said that perhaps the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a sign of God's anger with them for holding pride parades. I'm not joking, he said this. We have some real problems here, right? The big you're wrong about when it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah is that their sin is not homosexuality at all, not even a little bit, and we will talk more about that. But beyond that, this text invites us to ask deep and unsettling questions about who we're willing to throw under the bus or what we're willing to sacrifice to preserve the status quo, as messed up as the status quo may be, what we're willing to do to avoid conflict or discomfort. And at the foundation of all of it is this sacred command to welcome strangers, the very opposite of what this text too often does. So let's take a look at the story together. The first thing we should pay attention to is the context in which the story appears. It doesn't happen out of nowhere, right? Like I mentioned, the story is preceded in Genesis 18 by a famous story about hospitality when 3 strangers, who turn out to be God and 2 angels, show up out of nowhere at Abraham's house. I feel like hospitality maybe is not the best translation. In our world today, hospitality is a word we kind of associate like with Martha Stewart or like with the restaurant and hotel industry, right? But Abraham models the ideal kind of hospitality that was deeply important in the ancient world, especially among nomadic tribal cultures. He invites the strangers into his home, he feeds them, and he gives them a safe place to rest. Abraham is the well-known protagonist of the whole book of Genesis. He's famous for being righteous, and he's kind of here to show us how it's done. This story is also where we get that book later in Hebrews. You might have heard it before, that verse that says we should always welcome strangers, we should share what we have because we might be entertaining angels unaware. You heard that before? Yeah. So set against the story of Abraham's perfectly righteous hospitality, the story of what happens to 2 strangers in Sodom is its foil, its opposite. It's a story to show us exactly what hospitality is not, and it doesn't hold back in making that distinction clear. So understanding the story's context, we're already thinking about it a little bit differently, and let's let's keep looking. Let's move on and think about another question. Is this story about homosexuality? When the strangers show up in Sodom, Lot is the person who is on watch at the gate that night. Now remember, Lot's not originally from there, right? But despite that, he must have at least become tolerated by the men of Sodom, accepted in some way because he's serving in a position of authority. He immediately invites the strangers to stay with him, which should kind of be our first clue that something maybe is a little off. They tell him, oh, no, we don't want to impose. We'll be fine just spending the night here in the town square. In a traditionally hospitable town and one that followed the laws of the God of Israel, this would be a perfectly reasonable request. Those passing through should be welcomed and cared for and respected. But Sodom is not a righteous town. So Lot talks the strangers out of staying in the square, believing that he can protect them in his own home for the night. And now this is where we get some confusion. Because after Lot does all the right things you're supposed to do in the name of hospitality, he invites the men in, he feeds them, he prepares a place for them to sleep for the night. The men of the town, all of them, gather at Lot's house and demand that he release the strangers to them. Aha, says Pat Robertson. See, they were gay, and because of that, God destroyed the city. But is that really what it says? Let's take a closer look. Let's start maybe in verse 19:4. Notice the pains the author takes to emphasize that every man, maybe even every person in town, is involved in this standoff. It says, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all people to the last man. That's like a lot of emphasis, right? Was every single man and boy in the city of Sodom gay? I mean, even in the gay meccas of our age, we don't see this kind of completely homogenous population, right? There is always a bachelorette party at a gay bar. It would have been extremely unlikely that every man and boy in this town was gay, and the kind of imagined homosexual predator, right, that's been used to this day to deny rights to the LGBT community. What is actually very likely is that as the men of Sodom kind of say to Lot later, not in so many words, they want to show their dominance over these visitors. They want to humiliate and scare them by gang raping them, a common violent tool in the ancient world and in modern wars still for demoralizing your enemies. Here's something really interesting to pay attention to as we read the Bible for what it says about gender and sexuality. In the ancient world, sexual orientation really does never come up. The thing people are concerned with is gender. When men have sex with other men, it destroys the hierarchy, right? You're relegating one man to this position occupied by a woman, a lower status in the hierarchy, a position subordinate to their power. You'll notice, for example, that the Old Testament is silent on sex between women. Doesn't say anything, because it's not a threat to their gender identity or to their position in the hierarchy, right? The men of Sodom didn't want to enter into a consensual relationship with the two strangers because of their sexual orientation. The men of Sodom wanted to dominate and humiliate two foreigners because of their xenophobia and lack of hospitality. And then, then Lot offers the angry mob his own daughters. Probably three things about this. One, WTF, right? What is happening? Two, it's another clue that this was not an attack by gay men, or why would Lot have even considered that his daughters would be an enticing replacement for the strangers? But three, this awful part of the story is supposed to be shocking to us. It is supposed to show us how unbelievably far Lot will go in order to show hospitality to strangers. In the end, it's no use anyways. The men of the town are not satisfied and continue to demand that Lot turn over the strangers. And they begin to threaten him too, saying in verse 9, "This fellow came here as a foreigner, and he would play the judge? Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Which itself is another clue, right? We will deal worse with you than with them. Seems to pretty clearly reveal the men of Sodom were trying to harm the strangers. They really kind of tip their hand here, revealing that as much as Lot might think he's been accepted into the community, the others still think of him as someone who doesn't really belong. Their inhospitality extends beyond these two angelic strangers that they met a few hours ago to Lot, their longtime friend and neighbor, who they will never forget is different from them. Thank God, I mean, literally thank God for stepping in at just that moment as the angel struck the men of the town blind and saved Lot's daughters and themselves from bodily harm that night. So Sodom and Gomorrah are mentioned in several other places throughout the Bible. I'm going to ask Jen to put up a slide for us, mostly as it's just an example of kind of general wickedness. Don't be like these wicked cities. But there are a few places that give us more of a clue to how the story's original and early audiences would have interpreted the sin of these ill-fated cities. So is there somebody on Zoom who would please just unmute and read this for us from Ezekiel 1? I can't see you, so just go for it.
This is the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were proud, had plenty to eat, and enjoyed peace and prosperity. But she didn't help the poor and the needy. They became haughty and did detestable things in front of me, and I turned away from them as soon as I saw it.
Huh. So what do you notice is not mentioned in this passage? Homosexuality? Or anything having to do with sex at all, really. I mean, detestable things could cover a lot. Much more important is that Sodom and Gomorrah were places where people were prosperous and grew too comfortable. They stopped sharing. They refused to help those who needed it. There's one more we'll look at from the New Testament this time. Somebody jump in and read that for us on Zoom.
If anyone refuses to welcome you or listen to your words, shake the dust off your feet as you leave that house or city. I assure you that it will be more bearable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on Judgment Day than it will be for that city.
These are the words of Jesus to his disciples. He's trying to teach them how to respond when they aren't welcomed, when they encounter inhospitality. And again, I know we don't think of it in the same way today, but to Jesus, the kind of hospitality that was shown by Abraham, where you are always ready to welcome someone who is different from you, to share what you have, to privilege the safety of others, it's so important to Jesus that missing that mark has eternal consequences. You know, I think that the reason this text has become sort of a shorthand for gay bashing is similar to the reason that the men of Sodom surrounded Lot's home that night. Collectively, we would rather throw our LGBTQ siblings under the bus than hold ourselves accountable for the ways in which we too have failed to follow Abraham's righteous model of hospitality. Like Lot's sons-in-law who preferred to take their chances with hellfire and keep the wickedly prosperous lives they knew, or even Lot's wife who was so connected to life in this city despite its wickedness that she lost her own life. We too are not all that eager to recognize when our actions harm others or go against God's teachings. In this country, new laws popping up every week restricting the rights of especially our non-binary and transgender siblings really reveal our true colors. Instead of heeding God's call to protect the most vulnerable, to welcome the stranger, to accept those who are different from us, we, like the people of Sodom, would rather cling to our comfort. We'd rather not be forced outside the lines of what we already know and understand in order to welcome someone else. I don't think it's any coincidence that the two texts we've studied so far in this series, in the Bible, gender, and sexuality, right, Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch last week, and now this, I don't think it's any coincidence that these also address prejudice against people who are not from here, right? Sexual orientation, gender identity, race, national origin, ethnicity, we don't really care what the difference is. We just don't want to be uncomfortable having to face it. And so we're left at the end of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah with a new understanding, perhaps, of just what the story is about, and at the same time with a sense of unease, right, that we can't really push aside. I know I did say we would all be uncomfortable this Lent. Here you go. What does God want to show us about our own attitudes toward practices of hospitality, personally or as a church family, or even as a country? That's the question I hope that you leave with and can think about more this week. There's a question for reflection in your bulletin, and we'll put it in the newsletter and Facebook this week for you to think about. It's this: when have you experienced hospitality? When have you felt fully welcomed and cared for? And what difference did that make to you? We'll think about it throughout the week, and there's also a prayer. God, build our capacity to show hospitality to others through generous welcome. Help us find ways to provide safe and caring spaces for those who need to find them. Amen. To tell us a little bit, to give us an example, I guess, to encourage and inspire us, one of our church members this week took a brave action to create a welcome and caring space for LGBTQ siblings. That's Olivia. I'm going to ask her to share a little bit about what happened.
Hi.
Hi.
Basically, I'd seen on Instagram that there was gonna be like a national like queer-led youth walkout all over the country, like in protest of the treatment of like trans and gay kids in like Texas and Florida and stuff. And so I was like, why not do it at my school? And so I contacted administration and the GSA, and we ended up planning like a walkout on Friday. And I didn't think that many people would show up, but like half the school walked out, and it was pretty crazy. And people were like signing like this banner and stuff, and they hung the banner in the cafeteria. And I gave a speech, and we stood out there for like 20 minutes, and then everybody went back in.